I'm Matthew Hibden, the Strategic Communications Manager in the College of Liberal Arts at MTSU. The 2021 Lifelong Learning Program was co-presented with the MTSU Alumni Association and explored the topic of the Roaring Twenties. The last session for the day was entitled Distilling in Tennessee, the Lasting Effects of Prohibition. And it was co-presented by our friends at the Tennessee Distillers Guild, whose executive director is Sara Beth Urban, a two-time graduate of the Department of History at MTSU, and Cascade Hollow Distilling Company, which is located right down the road here in Middle Tennessee. So please sit back and enjoy this great presentation, and I hope you learned something.
I'm the executive director for the Tennessee Distillers Guild. I've been with the guild now for about a year and a half, and I work with them on advocacy and promotion, as well as promoting the Tennessee Whiskey Trail.
Nick Smizik. I'm the special projects lead for George Stickel, run our single barrel program as well as a few other things, and looking forward to spending a few minutes with you today.
And I am Ryan Yamada. I am the field manager for the Accelerator program, which is part of the marketing effort for Diageo products. The Accelerator program specifically works with George Stickel as a brand, as well as Blade & Bow, and I'll be walking us through some cocktails today.
Great. And again, we welcome our speakers. I'm going to get out of the way and let them get to the heart of what we're talking about. But as we explore the Roaring Twenties, a big part of that was prohibition, and there are lasting effects of that in the distilling industry that the industry is still working through today. And Sara Beth is going to start off and give kind of a historical overview. She is a two-time graduate of our Department of History, and we are so excited to have her with us tonight.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. It's good to see everybody here tonight. I'm a particular fan tonight of Luann, who's clearly like on a treadmill or an elliptical, and I love that. Multitasking to the 10th degree, that's amazing. So yeah, as Matt said, I'm a graduate of the history program, and I got my master's in public history, and then I'm actually currently teaching at MTSU too. I'm teaching in the tourism and hospitality management program. So I'm excited to kind of combine all of that together in my current job and get to talk to you all a little bit about history and a little bit about tourism. So I'm going to jump into screen share mode so you guys can see my presentation. And Matt, if things go off the rail and things stop working, please let me know. We're going to talk about distilling in Tennessee, the lasting effects of prohibition. So I'll give you a start with a little bit of an intro with the Tennessee Distillers Guild. So we're a membership organization for distilleries in the state of Tennessee. Our mission is to responsibly promote and advocate for the distilling industry in Tennessee through the collective voice of our members. So we work with the legislature a lot. We do a lot of education, not only for our members, but for the general public. We offer networking for our members, support, and then obviously we do a lot of promotion. And a lot of that promotion is geared towards the Tennessee Whiskey Trail, which is our statewide tour of Tennessee distilleries that ranges all the way from Memphis to Bristol. So there are 25 distilleries on the trail, and that ranks from internationally recognized brands like George Stickel, who's on here tonight, as well as Jack Daniels, all the way to small craft brands like H. Clark and Thompson Station, if anyone has heard of them before. He operates his distillery out of about a 1,000 square foot, 200-year-old granary building. So everybody does it a little bit differently. And we are appreciative of all of our members and what they bring to the trail. One thing that I love about the Tennessee Whiskey Trail is that it's so much more than Tennessee whiskey. So if you're not a huge whiskey fan, there's still plenty along the trail for you. We've got a lot of moonshine out in East Tennessee. A lot of our distilleries are making gin or vodka. There's a lot of different stuff. So you can always find your niche on the Tennessee Whiskey Trail. But we have a printed passport if you prefer, or we have an app that you can download on your phone. And one thing that's really cool that we just started this past year in 2020 was you can actually collect a poker chip along the way on all of our distilleries. They all have their little brands on them. And then when you complete the Tennessee Whiskey Trail, which is a feat unto itself because you visited 25 distilleries, you get a full poker set that's branded with Tennessee Whiskey Trail. So I encourage everyone to get out, especially now that it's getting safe again. We're very excited to welcome our visitors back to the Tennessee Whiskey Trail. So that being said, let me jump into a little bit of the history. I'm gonna move this a little bit. There we go. All right, so I can't see anybody anymore, but I assume you're all still there. So Tennessee has a history of being pretty temperate, or the temperance movement. Tennessee has been advocating for prohibition since the early 1800s, really. In 1824 was when they passed the first law restricting liquor sales near churches. And the first Tennessee temperance societies were meeting in Nashville and Kingsport, I believe, as early as 1829. And that's where the wonderful image that you see next to us of the ladies underneath the sign that says, "Lips that touch liquor shall never touch ours." That was a very popular slogan among the temperance movement in Tennessee. As I'm sure y'all are aware, we are in the Bible Belt of the South, and sometimes people like to call Tennessee the buckle of the Bible Belt. So there's just a lot of people use religious reasons or a lot of different things to be anti-alcohol, not understanding not only we promote responsibility and moderation, but also that we also have a lot of benefit other than just producing alcohol. There's jobs, there's agriculture and the economy. There's a lot of things that go into it. So, and then in 1854, you have the first attempt to put statewide prohibition out to the general public with the voters. That effort passed in the Senate and failed in the House, so it didn't really go anywhere. But it was only shortly thereafter that they passed what's called the 4 Mile Law, which when it was originally constructed, prohibited the sale of liquor within 4 miles of any rural charter school. And then later in 1887 is when they expanded that to within 4 miles of any country school, which basically eliminated all liquor sales in rural Tennessee. So really only your main cities at that point in time still had liquor available. And one just interesting bit of facts or interesting tidbit that I found out in my research on this was that Harriman, Tennessee, which I don't know if anybody's from Harriman, that was actually founded on the principles of prohibition. The city was founded to become an industrial center that prohibited alcohol to show the positive effects. Unfortunately, the city never took off, and so it kind of was a moot point. Also, another interesting tidbit, I feel like everybody kind of knows who Edward Carmack is now, but it used to be one of those things that people would go and visit our state capitol in Nashville and see the statue out in front of the legislature and be like, who's that dude? Because he's not a former governor. He's not, he's just not nationally known. And, usually you can kind of recognize the people around the Capitol, like Andrew Jackson, Alvin C. York, those kinds of figures. But Edward Carmack, he was a state and federal representative as well as a senator for Tennessee. And what I wrote on there is, if you'll see, I called him an advantageous prohibitionist because he wasn't really anti-alcohol. He was more just mad that he lost an election. And so he took a stance against someone that he thought would benefit him, and actually published a disparaging op-ed in the Nashville Tennessean at the time about Duncan Cooper, who just happened to be a close friend of the governor's. And Cooper's son actually went out and shot him and killed him in downtown Nashville back in 1908. It was a huge scandal. The governor went on to pardon Cooper and his son. But what really happened there is that it made Carmack a martyr for the prohibition movement because he just kind of jumped on their bandwagon at the end of his life. They kind of said, look at what alcohol does to people. It makes them crazy and shoot people in downtown Nashville, which is obviously not true. Actually, there's evidence to suggest that Carmack shot first. So what it does, though, is it gives some fodder for the prohibitionist movement. And in 1909, actually, Tennessee passed the first statewide ban on prohibition. So basically what they did is they took the 4 mile rule and expanded it across the entire state. So nowhere could serve liquor, really. Most of your major cities, i.e. Nashville and Memphis, kind of ignored it up to still at this point, and didn't really do any enforcement. And then obviously 1920 happened and national prohibition passed. And we all know how that went. It wasn't like people really took it that seriously. It's when the rise of the speakeasies happened and house parties. And as you can see here, these young folks who are just in compliance with the 18th Amendment, they've got a lot of bottles of alcohol. So prohibition was not super successful, and that included in Tennessee. So fast forward a little bit, obviously lots of drama during the 1920s with Al Capone and the Rum Runners, which is actually where NASCAR came out of. I don't know if y'all know that, but NASCAR drivers started out running moonshine, and they were running from the cops. They would soup up their engines, and that's how they would get away. And so they started racing off of that. But if you go all the way to 1933, that's when the 21st Amendment was repealed nationally. However, Tennessee did not vote to repeal. So basically the National Amendment went away, so it wasn't dictated across the country, but the state laws were allowed to continue if they wanted to, and Tennessee's continued. So what really happened during this time, and especially during Prohibition, is it really just destroyed the legal spirits trade in Tennessee. Before 1908, there were hundreds of distilleries in the state of Tennessee. And I wish, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not at all. Like, there were hundreds in, like, I think the numbers in Chattanooga alone were so substantial that there was like one distillery per 20 residents in Chattanooga or something along those lines. So the numbers were astronomical at the time, but really what Prohibition did was just kind of kill all of that industry. Some of our brands thrive by moving their production facilities out of the state of Tennessee. But then when you get into May 21st, 1937, which, remember that date because we're going to come back to it, that is when the manufacturing ban ended. Now, you still technically couldn't buy and drink it in the state, but I would assume that meant that the legislature at the time realized that the production could bring back some industry to the state of Tennessee at the end of the Great Depression. And then it was 1939 when, as you can see there, I put Tennessee finally repeals Prohibition, sort of, because many, many counties continued to be dry. Basically, they left it up to your local county or city boards, elected officials, and a lot of them chose to remain dry. So you had your major cities that welcomed liquor back in. Obviously, in 1940, as soon as the year was up, Jack Daniel's reopened its facilities. I'm assuming I have the dates correct on George Dickel, but I would assume those guys can correct me when they come on board if it was 1950s or not. And then you kind of see, I fast forward a little bit to 1997, and I mentioned Pritchard's. And that is the last time before 2009 a distillery opened in the state of Tennessee, because there were only 3 counties up until 2009 that were allowed to have distilleries. Distillation was illegal in all other 92 counties in the state. So only Moore County, Coffee County, and Lincoln County were allowed to have distilleries. In 2009, that finally changed through the work of several of our distilleries that are still members in the guild, Heath Clark being one of those. He's a lawyer in addition to being a distiller. They worked with the legislature to allow it. So when the law passed, actually, I think about 44 counties in one fell swoop became eligible for this. I think that's on my next slide. Yeah, under the new law, manufacturers will be allowed in any county where both retail package sales of liquor and liquor by the drink have been locally approved. So going back, the lasting effects though from Prohibition is we still have dry counties in the state of Tennessee, including Lynchburg-Moore County, where Jack Daniel's is. I'm sure everybody knows that by now. It's almost just a funny anecdote now. Who knows if they'll ever go wet? It's just too funny at this point in time. Liquor sales, though, in Tennessee, I mean, I'm sure everybody on this call knows that it wasn't allowed on Sundays until 2018. In Tennessee and across the nation, the liquor industry is heavily regulated and taxed. And we're still even calling liquor taxes sin taxes, which kind of goes back to that being in the Bible Belt and really bringing those religious concerns to the alcohol industry. So again, as I said, we passed new laws. So since 2009, we've had over 70 distilling operations open in the state of Tennessee. If you go and count the current licenses for distillation licenses, it's about 85, I believe. Some of those are duplicates. Some of those have gone out of business. But that's a lot of growth in a very short amount of time. So you see that there's a lot of desire for it. There's a lot of benefits that come from having a distillery in your area, including increased tourism numbers, more jobs, again, bringing in that agriculture because they have to buy local grains to make their product. And then on top of that, they give their spent match back to local farms for livestock to use. So there's a lot of benefits to it. And it's exciting to see such a huge boom going on right now. I don't know if we'll ever get back to one distillery per 20 people. But I definitely think there's still room for growth in Tennessee. So as I mentioned, keep in mind May 21st, 1937, because this year the Tennessee legislature declared International Tennessee Whiskey Day to be May 21st in perpetuity. So this May 21 will be the very first International Tennessee Whiskey Day. And we are very excited to be celebrating this. I'm excited to be on the call with our friends from Stickel tonight, because this is such a big achievement for us and such a great recognition for an industry that has worked so hard to get here and to come back from these Prohibition era concerns. And then on top of that, what we've all been through this last year, our distilleries, instead of kind of, just closing shop and being, just kind of being on their own and worrying about their own businesses during the pandemic, almost every single distillery in the guild turned around and produced hand sanitizer at the beginning of the pandemic. They stopped production on their own alcohol and switched to this, and it was a huge help to first responders, to essential workers, to the elderly in nursing homes. We were able to do so much, give so many gallons away because they were willing to learn something new that none of them had ever done before. They were willing to work with the FDA and figure this out. So I was really excited to be able to get this recognition for our distilleries this year, and hopefully from now until eternity, I guess. But yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell Prohibition and how the guild came out of that. So I want to stop here so I can see everybody's faces again. I hope that's okay. But if y'all have any questions about kind of my brief history, and then I'll let the Stickel guys take it over and show you guys how to make a cocktail.
And you were talking about the hand sanitizer, Sara Beth.
Yes.
Big Machine Distillery had the partnership with MTSU to give us some for campus.
I have one too. I don't have the MTSU one, but this is Old Glory. It's actually a little spray bottle that I can spray my hand. So everybody did it in their own way. I don't know if y'all saw Corsair did it in their gin bottles. They even made it into the Nashville scene. Nashville scene made a funny joke about them that said, you're in Nashville if your gin and your hand sanitizer is from Corsair. So, but it was, like I said, our distillery stepped up, and it was really great to see. So, but any questions from the group before I turn it over to Nicholas and Ryan? All right.
Okay.
Well, I'll be here, so if something pops in your head, let me know.
And I do have to give a shout out to our friends over in the College of Basic and Applied Sciences too, that have a fermentation sciences program. So we have one of the only fermentation sciences program in the state, and one of the biggest ones in the Southeast as we grow that. So Sara Beth was talking about the economic impact that distilleries have. And so our MTSU students who are in that program are going to be graduating and going into jobs. So Ryan and Nick, if you need some Blue Raiders to come work in the distillery, call up Dr. Tony Johnston. So I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. But Ryan is going to kick off the Cascade.
Matt, I think Ruben has a question.
Okay, yeah.
Please your hand, Ruben. You're on mute.
Let's see. There you
go. What's the final resolution about the definition of Tennessee whiskey?
Oh, great question. Well, I don't want to step on your toes though. Nick or Ryan, were y'all going to cover that?
What now? Say that again.
Nick, you're on mute too.
Never fails. Sara Beth, I can talk about it, or go for it.
Yeah, go for it. I'll let you answer. You guys are the pros.
So correct me if I'm wrong. 2014.
Yes.
And I'm a huge supplier of little known facts. So 2014 was the first time that Tennessee defined Tennessee whiskey as a category. Prior to that, the only place that Tennessee whiskey was defined was in NAFTA for overseas trade. But in 2014, as Sara Beth mentioned, prior to that, there were only a handful of distilleries in Tennessee, and they all kind of had a gentleman's handshake of, we know what you're doing, and we know what you're doing, so we're fine with the three or four of us sticking to what Tennessee whiskey is. And just after 2000, when that law changed and more distilleries were coming around, it got a little questionable. Was everybody going to do the Lincoln County process? Were they not going to do the Lincoln County process? And I'll get into that, what that exactly is and what it does to the whiskey here in a few minutes. But really, that was the first time that there was a question of whether or not everybody was going to be on the same page. So that's really when the state started to define what Tennessee was, how it was to be produced, and what could actually put Tennessee whiskey on the label. Like I said, we'll get into a little bit more of what all that means here in a few minutes. But yeah, it was just in 2014. I ask that question all the time, and people say, pre-Prohibition, right after Prohibition, but it was just a few years ago. Any other questions? Oh, Ruben, you're back on mute.
Okay. Now, the other day I saw an ad for some distiller that advertised itself as Tennessee bourbon.
Oh, give me a few minutes and we'll discuss the whole bourbon Tennessee whiskey thing.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'll shut up.
All good. We're going to let Ryan's going to help us out, make a quick cocktail, and then I'll get into some history of George Dickel.
All right. Fantastic. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to give you just another quick history lesson here. Sara Beth, that was fantastic. Love hearing all of that, and really how important Tennessee is to the whole spirits movement is really exciting. And Nick will get into that some as well. But to talk to you a little bit about the history of the cocktail, we've got to go back to 1806. And there was a publication out of Hudson, New York, that was talking about recipes in their newspaper. And someone wrote in to ask them to define the word cocktail that they'd used. And the very first time that the word cocktail was defined was in 1806, and it was defined as a concoction of potent spirits, bitters, water, and sugar. And so kind of as we look here, that is the framework for the old-fashioned cocktail. So the first definition of a cocktail was the ingredient list to make an old-fashioned cocktail. But you've got to fast forward all the way from 1806 to sort of the 1860s. And so by the 1860s, barkeeps were introducing more exotic ingredients into their cocktails. They were introducing absinthe and orange curacao, brandy, other ingredients. Citrus had made its way into the cocktail world as well. And so by the late 1860s, people who had been used to drinking those original cocktails, that spirit, water, bitter, sugar combination, started asking colloquially for those old-fashioned cocktails. I want one of those old-fashioned cocktails. But it wasn't until the early 1880s that someone took that colloquialism that people were referring to with the cocktails and actually placed it on a menu. And there's a couple different reports. Some people say it was first in Louisville. Some people say the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Some people say Chicago. So there's a little bit of debated history where the first publication of the actual old fashioned on a menu comes from. But all that to say, it owes its roots back to that early 1806 newspaper article. And so what we're going to do today for you all, with the three cocktails that I'm going to be making, we're doing some of those riffs, some of those variations on kind of classic cocktails. And the first one, I think it's appropriate to start off with the old fashioned. And so something I want to reference today is a book. I love this book. It's called The Flavor Bible. And so the Flavor Bible is really great because it breaks down any kind of flavor and tells you what pairs with it. And so pairing flavors together is going to be really important, especially creating seasonal cocktails. So the old fashioned that we're going to create is a pre-Prohibition style old fashioned. As you drink your old fashioned, there are different ways to drink this as well. So sometimes you'll see people muddling the cherries and the orange together, so you have that fruit pulp in it. That kind of old fashioned is actually called a cobbler style old fashioned. In Wisconsin, they'll add soda or Sprite to their old fashioned. That's a Wisconsin style old fashioned. What we're making today is a pre-Prohibition classic style old fashioned. So to do that, we're going to take our rocks glass and we're actually going to take a citrus peel. With our citrus peel, we're going to use this twofold. One for kind of the essences and the oils that are in the peel, and secondly for garnish. Once we've peeled our orange, we're going to take that and then just gently rub it on the inside of our glass and then set our orange peel kind of off to the side because we'll use that for garnish. In a mixing glass, we're going to combine our ingredients. And like I said, I'm doing some seasonal variations on these classic recipes. Traditionally, you would make this with a demerara or a raw sugar simple syrup, your choice of a whiskey, bourbon, rye, any kind of brown spirit. You'd even be as cavalier enough to do something like a brandy. Then your combination of bitters with that, and then you dilute it by stirring it with ice to bring the proof down. Traditionally, Angostura bitters would be used with this, but like I said, making some seasonal variations with the flavor Bible in mind, I'm going to be playing around with a little bit of flavors. So the bitters that I'm using today are actually a local bitter company, 615 Bitters, and they've got a really cool chocolate and chili bitters. And so we're going to do a couple dashes of that into our mixing glass to start off with. Now, when you're experimenting with flavors, especially with bitters, I wouldn't take a drink of it necessarily, but to get what a bitter kind of tastes like, bitters taste like, you can use your olfactory senses, your sense of smell. So a couple of drops into the palm of your hand, if you rub them together and then smell, your olfactory sense lends a lot of your sense of taste as well. So by smelling those, you get an idea of what those flavors are going to come like. So I've got a nice bright green chili in here and chocolate. Chocolate and orange are a really nice pairing in the flavor Bible. See those together. And what I'm choosing for our spirit today is actually going to be the George Dickel rye. In the 1880s, rye was a very popular ingredient in old fashions. We saw the first rise of rye during that time. For our old fashioned day, we're going to do 2 ounces of the George Dickel rye. And why I'm doing that is, again, I'm thinking about the pairing flavors. And one of the great flavor notes that I get out of George Dickel rye is a really nice menta, a nice mint flavor, that kind of herbaceousness. And so mint and chocolate and orange, all those flavors pair really, really well together. For our sweetening agent today, I'm actually doing a maple syrup. So traditionally, like I said, you could do that demerara syrup or simple syrup, but I'm doing maple syrup today just because I want to bring out the richness of that. I'm going to do a 1/2 ounce of that. So all those liquids are now combined in there. I'm going to add a little bit of ice. And then we're going to take our spoon and I'm going to stir all of that together. What we're doing is we're cooling that cocktail down. We're diluting that cocktail down. We're emulsifying all the ingredients together. You're going to stir it for about 30 seconds. Now all those flavors combined, we've proofed it down a little bit. The ice we're seeing starting to melt in there as well. We're going to strain it back over fresh ice into our rocks glass. So we're combining all those flavors again together. And we'll take that orange peel that we had from the very beginning, express a little bit more of the orange essence out of there, give it a nice little flag there to enjoy our old-fashioned cocktail. Cheers, guys.
Thank you very much, Ryan. You're making me thirsty, and all I have is neat whiskey. So, I'll have to make an old-fashioned later. But we wanted to give you a little idea of some cocktails, and then I'm going to give you some history, and then we're going to bring Ryan back for a couple more seasonal cocktails. So, and I believe I'm on the wrong screen. Hold on just one second. There we go. No? Am I on the right screen, or do you see yourselves?
We can see the PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect. So this is our visitor center. We currently are open Thursday through Sunday throughout the summer. So we'd love to have some of you folks join us if you're local to Tennessee. You can get online, or you can call, or you can just come in and visit us. just an absolutely amazing place, just south of Murfreesboro, down right between Tullahoma and Normandy. Just a very, very special place. And just over the past couple of years, we've had some really cool milestones. We hit 150th anniversary just last year that George Dickel whiskey has been around. And I love showing this. It's just got some old marketing stuff from the 80s and 80s, probably back to the 70s a little bit. We had some cool different times where we were partnering with some country music artists. And if anybody remembers the Waters for Floating, Dickels for Drinking, or whatnot with Merle Haggard, we had some really cool stuff back then. This picture, this black and white picture right in the center, if you come to the distillery, you'll realize that it kind of still looks the same way. Not much has changed. We've got one little extra tower in here, and the smokestacks aren't quite as tall, but the building hasn't changed much since the late 50s, early 60s. So a little bit deeper into history. George Dickel, there was an actual guy. It's not just a marketing idea or anything. George was an actual guy. He was born in Germany in 1818, immigrated to the States in right in the middle of the 1800s. And he was a cobbler. He was a shoemaker, landed in Nashville, and very quickly realized that he needed to be doing something a little bit more than just making shoes. So he started what we would nowadays consider a chain of general stores all across Middle Tennessee, both in Nashville, but then also in surrounding areas. And if you think about general stores in the late 1800s, it was very much still a barter system. If you had extra corn, you would bring it to the general store, get what you needed. If you had a cattle farm, you would bring your extra beef to the general store, and you would get what you needed. One of the things that included in very a lot of different ways was whiskey. There were a lot of different farmers, and Sara Beth kind of mentioned this. A lot of different farmers that were corn growers and had different grains that they grew on their farms, and they just needed something to be able to do with those extra grains that would make them shelf stable and make them last a little bit longer. So they would turn it into whiskey, and then they would bring that whiskey to the general store, get what they needed, and then the general store would pass that whiskey along to other folks. In about the 1860s, George met his wife, who was from down in the Tullahoma area, and her brother convinced him to go in partners with a distillery that was there. It was Cascade Distillery. And his brother-in-law really kept the operation on a day-to-day basis, running the distillery, running all the whiskey making, production, whatnot. And then it was George that was selling it through his general stores. Unfortunately, in the late 1800s, George passed away on a horse, or from an injury that he sustained on a horse ride back and forth to Tullahoma. Now you can make it from Nashville to Tullahoma in just over an hour in your car, but realized back then on horse, it was probably at least a 2-day trip. And he had fallen off a horse, broken his leg, and a couple of years later succumbed to those injuries. But he passed away, like I said, late 1800s. His wife and brother-in-law kept the operation going all the way up until Prohibition. And Prohibition, as we mentioned, Prohibition hit Tennessee a little bit early, hit in 1911, where the rest of the country was 1917. And we had to shut down the distillery. They had to dismantle everything that was there. But they moved up to Kentucky, and they partnered with Stickel Distillery, which today is actually where we make bullet bourbon, as well as some other things. So they partnered with Stickel, and they continued making whiskey all through Prohibition. Stickel had one of the 6 medicinal licenses during Prohibition that they could still make whiskey. You just had to have a doctor's prescription to be able to get it. 1917, U.S. Prohibition hit, and all but those 6 distilleries had to shut down. And I'll hit on a little bit other. I was doing some research on Prohibition this afternoon. I found out a couple little things that I didn't even know. But it wasn't until 1958 that a gentleman that was running the company for us at the time by the name of Ralph Dukes. He had, as a young man, we'll call it, there wasn't drinking ages pre-Prohibition. So as a young man, he had tried some of George's old whiskey, and always thought there was better whiskey to be made in Tennessee than there was in Kentucky. But it took him a while. Prohibition came back or Tennessee came back from Prohibition in 1939, but it took him until 1958 to convince the company to move back to Tennessee. At that time, they finally conceded and say, okay, let's move this back to Tennessee. Let's move this back to our roots. He came back down, found the original Cascade spring that the distillery was set up on, but realized very quickly that there wasn't enough land right there at the spot of the spring head where the original distillery was to build a full-on production facility. So they went just about a quarter mile down the road, on the same creek with the same water, and they built that full-on production facility that I showed you just a minute ago. They built the distillery in 1958, finished it in 59. First whiskey went in 58, 59, came out in 64. And for those of you that get a chance to come down and visit us, you'll see that not much has changed since 1959. It's still Sara Beth's smiling. She's been there before. It very much looks like 1959. That point, it was state of the art. It was some amazing production facility. We kind of go with it's not broke, don't fix it, and we still doing things the way that we were in late 50s, early 60s. We still have weighted scales. There's not much of any computers within the building. Everything is done by hand. So just a very cool step back in time to see the way it was done years ago, but the way it can still be done. So I pulled a couple little oddball facts about Prohibition before I get into some other things. One of them was that it technically wasn't illegal to drink whiskey during Prohibition. It was illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport of intoxicating liquors. Never said anything about drinking liquor. You just couldn't sell it, you couldn't make it, you couldn't transport it. So there was a lot of other things being made. There was, the term bathtub gin, but unfortunately, a lot of people died from that because it wasn't being made in the right way. So definitely a dark time in a lot of people's minds during Prohibition. And then the other cool thing that I didn't even, I guess I just really never thought about, kind of going into Prohibition. A big push was World War I, because a lot of folks that were already on the temperance movement were saying that those grains could be used for better things. The grain that's used to make beer, to make whiskey, could be used for better things in the war effort. And then it was the Great Depression that really brought the country out of it and got a lot of folks to realize that maybe we should rethink this. And realizing that there were over 30,000 speakeasies running operations during Prohibition. So people were still able to get it. They just weren't doing it in the most legal of terms. So just some cool Prohibition facts. Little bit of kind of what we are and what it is. So I love this slide. I'll kind of walk everybody through it, but it's a really good explanation of what Tennessee whiskey is, and what makes us different, but also what makes us the same as other things. So Tennessee whiskey, first off, is bourbon. Bourbon is a type of whiskey, and Tennessee is a type of bourbon. So if you're a Scotch drinker, think things like Highland Scotch. It's just a regional classification of a type of whiskey. If you're a wine drinker, and this one always kind of hits home for folks, if you're a wine drinker, think, you can have a Cabernet, but you can have a Cabernet from California. You can have a Cabernet from Napa. And having bourbon is kind of like saying a California cab, but if you get into Napa and Sonoma, Napa would be like Bourbon County, Kentucky, and Sonoma would be Tennessee whiskey. So it's just another regional classification of different types of whiskey. So when and I mentioned earlier, we defined Tennessee whiskey just recently in 2014. And literally when they created that classification within the law, they copied and pasted all the requirements for bourbon. So it had to be made in the US, it had to be at least 51% corn. There's some distillation stuff, distillation and proof numbers, and then it had to be aged in a new oak barrel, new charred oak barrel. So we took all those classifications or all those rules for bourbon, we copied and pasted them, and we added two things to it. One being that it was from a particular state. It had to be made in Tennessee. It's kind of a definite need to be a Tennessee whiskey. And then the other thing was the Lincoln County process, the charcoal mellowing that we do at George Dickel. There's a few others in Tennessee that do it as well. But in order to call yourself Tennessee whiskey, you had to be those two things in addition to all the bourbons rules. So Ruben, to your question earlier, if you hit those first few, then you can call yourself a Tennessee bourbon. If you hit those last two, then you can be called Tennessee whiskey. But truly, we are bourbon. We just do that little extra step of the Lincoln County process. So what is that Lincoln County process? We talk about it a lot down at George Dickel. It really is what makes us unique from a lot of other whiskeys. This is part of it. We make our own charcoal right on site down at the distillery. Unfortunately, I've only seen pictures of it. They do it at like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. So I haven't been there to actually see it, but we get sugar maple charcoal from within about 100 miles of the distillery. We have a local stave mill, cut it down into 2-inch by 2-inch by 4-foot long sticks for us. We open air season it for about 6 months, and then we light it on fire and we create our own charcoal, which is truly an art because if you burn it too much, you have ash, and that really doesn't do anything for you. If you don't burn it enough, then you have burnt wood, and you'll get a lot of smoky flavors from it. So what we're trying to do is create pure charcoal, pure carbon. And carbon is a natural filtration. If you've got a Brita water filter in your refrigerator or in your sink, that's activated charcoal that's in those water filters. And essentially what we're doing is the same thing as those Brita water filters. It's just distillation is a form of filtration. This is just a secondary form of filtration. And we're working on getting some samples, if you come to the distillery, of the whiskey just as it comes off the still, but then also after it goes through the charcoal. And not really to taste. I wouldn't suggest tasting any of them. But when you smell them, if you smell the whiskey straight off the still, it's kind of got an oiliness to it, or if you've ever been around a kitchen with a deep fat fryer, kind of has that oily, greasy smell to it. Once we put it through the charcoal, that all goes away. It cleans it up, kind of takes off some of the rough edges, but it leaves a lot of the flavor components that we want to stay in there. So I want everybody to realize that Tennessee whiskey isn't less than bourbon. It's actually more than bourbon because we're allowing a little bit more of the bourbon flavor to come out. So definitely an interesting process. And a lot of folks, not just in Tennessee, but in Kentucky as well, were doing this process during prior to Prohibition. When Prohibition came back, really there were only the 2 distilleries in Tennessee that stuck with that old tradition of doing the charcoal filtration. So I hope that answers a couple of those questions that we had out there outstanding. But would love to have some of you folks down to visit and taste some whiskey with us. And I will throw it back to Ryan. He's got a couple more cocktails to share with you all.
Perfect. All right, so we've got 2 more seasonal cocktails for everyone to enjoy. So the first one, again, was our old fashioned. Our riff on that was using some chocolate chili bitters and a maple syrup as our sweetening agent. So that's our old fashioned that we've kind of put together for you. And again, that pre-Prohibition style. So we're not muddling anything with that. We're just using the ingredients to create something clean and easy to enjoy. The next one that we're going to do is our Dickel Rye Ball. So we'll wait for them to kind of go to that one. Perfect. And so our Dickel Rye Ball is just a riff on a highball. The most popular highball today, highball is a classification of cocktails, is whiskey and ginger. So whiskey and ginger ale is a style of highball. And so what you have to create a highball is whiskey and then some sort of carbonated beverage. And these are really easy to do and really fun to kind of dress up for your cocktail parties or to enjoy on your own. So in making this a seasonal offering, again, we're going to be using our George Dickel rye. We're going to take 2 ounces of that. And we're going to pour it directly into a tall glass or a highball glass over ice. And then there are so many different flavors of these carbonated sodas at the grocery store. So it's really kind of take your pick your own adventure. What I chose today for a nice seasonal one is from this AHA company, and it is a strawberry cucumber soda. So you can see the cucumber neck that I have in here. And all you're going to do is just add your soda water on top of your whiskey. The carbonation from that soda and adding it actually does all of the mixing for you. As you can see, the kind of blended color in there. So that's ready to enjoy. And again, just something you're taking a classic cocktail recipe and just sprucing it up for kind of the summertime. So those strawberry and those cucumber flavors, making it something, you know, a little bit special to kind of to wow and awe and inspire your friends that may be joining for a cocktail party. So you've got those 2 on the side. The last cocktail that we're going to make today is our Dickel Daiquiri. And so our Dickel Daiquiri is actually, again, a type of sour. A sour is another one of those family of cocktails. And so you can make a sour out of any of these kind of base servings. The thing you've got to remember about a sour really is the ratios. And so to create a sour cocktail, not necessarily a whiskey sour per se with egg white or something like that, but the family of style of cocktail, a sour cocktail, follows a ratio of 2 parts base spirit, 1 part sweetening agent, so syrup, and then 1 part of your fruit juice, your citrus juice. And so what we're doing today, again, is doing a riff on our Dickel Daiquiri here, or our whiskey sour. And we are playing again with some summertime flavors. So we are going to be using our George Dickel number 12, some lemon juice, and a strawberry simple syrup to make a nice little George Dickel strawberry daiquiri or strawberry sour. And so for this one, you do get to do a little bit of shaking. So take your little cocktail kit and you're going to add some ice to it. We're going to be adding 1 ounce of our strawberry syrup. We're going to do 1 ounce of our lemon juice. And we're going to do 2 ounces of our George Dickel number 12. And so when you combine all that with ice, you're going to take your cocktail shaker and you're going to shake it for about 45 seconds. What you're doing here is you are breaking up the ice, you're emulsifying all the liquids together, and you're chilling it again. So when your guests drink it, they're enjoying a chilled cocktail. So those 3 things are really the point of shaking your cocktail. And so when you shake your cocktail, don't be afraid to shake it hard because you want to break that ice. You want it hitting all the parts of the shaker tin so it crushes the ice up and really chills that liquid and mixes it together. So after you shake your cocktail, you're going to go ahead and strain it out into your glass. And as you can see, we've got a nice little martini glass here with our strawberry garnish. And there we go. So our 3 summertime cocktails. We've got our strawberry Dickel Daiquiri, our strawberry cucumber Dickel Rye Ball, and our George Dickel rye old fashioned with chocolate and chili bitters. So some fun, just seasonal cocktails to kind of enjoy as the weather warms up. Any questions about the cocktails or anything? I can't see the chat quite yet, but I can look. There you go. The coupe glass would be perfect, right? There you go. So yeah, happy to answer any questions about cocktails, or really, like I said, those resources. Find the Flavor Bible, get in and start tasting some things on your own. And the highball is a fantastic warm weather cocktail, so easy to make. So feel free to go out and try all the different flavors of LaCroix, and pick up your favorite bottle of Dickel, whether it be the 12, the herbaceousness, or the more traditional flavors of like the number 12. Cheers, guys.